Welcome back to Posting Through It. I'm Jared.
And I'm Mike.
Some Patreon shout-outs out off the top. Nathaniel Miller, Joanna Berry, and Mark Rogowski. Thanks for supporting the show. And if you like what you hear today, consider signing up for our Patreon. $5 a month gets you access to weekly premium episodes, so you can get a little extra double dose of Posting Through It. The listener music we have this week comes from Ryan, who listens to Posting Through It and also produces analog techno music under the name Bat Teak out of Virginia Beach, Virginia. Ryan recently put out an album called Iteration Poor, and our transition track today is the 8th on that record called New Cringe Part 2. Mike, I think you'll like the transition music this week.
I'm excited.
So on this episode, we're going to keep talking about something we've been covering on this show over the last, I guess almost year and a half that we've been back, that ahead of the midterms and even 2028 and beyond, American democracy is not necessarily in a healthy place. The Trump movement, the MAGA movement, has been quite open in their desires to stack the deck to keep themselves in power after Trump won in 2024. This episode is a continuation of that. We're going to be talking about redistricting and gerrymandering and what's going on across the country. It's alarming, to say the least. The GOP was kind of set up for a bloodbath, Mike. I feel like last year we were talking about the Trump movement in this diminished state. His polls get worse and worse. People are stressing about the economy. Everything continues to get more expensive. People aren't making a lot more money. The Iran war business is angering a lot of people. The base itself is ripping itself apart over anti-Semitism, extremism, conspiracy theories, that sort of thing. But over the last few weeks, I've been hearing a lot of Republican-aligned commentators sounding a lot more confident about their chances in the midterms, thinking they might actually be able to hold on to the House.
Yeah. It's a point that we're going to bring up with our guest for sure, but it is starting to feel a lot like Hungary. It's a situation where they don't have the demographics on their side, for one thing. Even though there was a head fake in the opposite direction in 2024, they don't really have the demographics. First of all, I've seen polls, Jared, where Trump is like at 30% approval on the economy. Like it's like 70% against. Conventional wisdom, the economy is that is extraordinarily bad.
The cliche is people vote with their pocketbooks, right?
Yes. It's kind of like a white collar version of January 6th and some of the other maneuvers we've had. But I would say before we get into this conversation about that white collar stuff, it's important to remember that they're talking about using muscle on the election as well. Influential figures like Steve Bannon have talked about putting ICE agents around polling places. And I know he's gloating that Todd Blanche seemed to consider something like that publicly. So yeah, it's really, that is really, really concerning. It's a confluence of different things to potentially undermine our system of governance.
A lot of these efforts are trained at racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and immigrants, right? And Republican-led efforts around voting have been seeking that effect for decades, right? That's certainly nothing new, but it feels like the veneer is coming off now, where you have Trump and other Republicans coming out just being like, this is what we got to do to keep ourselves in charge. God forbid we become a minority in this country and end up treated the way that we treat them.
And there's also, other factors here, like the weakening of education over decades, the attempts to obfuscate what the Republicans are doing from the public. The most shady, cynical, evil things you can possibly imagine that have been going on for years, they are reaping the rewards of that, these strategies that have been going on for decades. But unfortunately for them, as we alluded to, this stuff isn't very popular. People don't like it. So, it's heading to a really profound conflict, I think, not only in this midterm, but also in the 2028 elections. It seems like a problem that keeps getting worse every election cycle.
So this is probably not going to be a real funny episode, feel-good episode, but it's hugely important. And if you care about America is a multiracial democracy, if you care about representation in your government, the ability to affect change, this is going to be critical listening. So I think with that, let's bring in Ari. You may have seen a lot of headlines recently about partisan redistricting efforts, wherein states are scrambling to redraw the lines of their congressional districts in hopes of giving their own political party an advantage before Republicans are set to defend their narrow majority in the U.S. House of Representatives in this year's midterm elections. Another word for that is gerrymandering, and it's brutally unpopular with the American public. So, how'd we get here? This week, we're joined by someone who knows an awful lot about voting in the U.S. to break down what's been going on and why it concerns all of us, even if we don't live in one of these states where it's happening. Ari Berman is a national voting rights correspondent at Mother Jones Magazine. He's written a couple books on this topic as well, which we'll link to in the description, including Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it, as well as Give Us the Ballot, the modern struggle for voting rights in America. Ari, welcome to Posting Through It.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.
Let's just start basic, because I was looking at some polling for a piece I was writing in my own job about this redistricting stuff, and I came across this poll in YouGov where they asked how people felt about gerrymandering. Spoiler alert, they don't like it. But before they asked what they thought about gerrymandering, they asked if people knew what it was or if people knew how redistricting worked. And that number was much lower than I expected it to, but maybe that's me just having worked in political media for a long time. Can you explain what redistricting is, what gerrymandering is, and what's happening right now?
Yeah, they're kind of different, obviously related, but
Right.
I mean, redistricting is basically just the redrawing of lines based theoretically on population changes to put people into districts, right? And there's nothing inherently nefarious about redistricting because it's constitutionally mandated to happen every 10 years after the census comes out. Gerrymandering is the nefarious part of redistricting, which basically is trying to draw lines to benefit certain faction over another, whether it's one party over another or one block of people over another, and basically the intentional manipulation of district lines for some kind of advantage.
Right now, we're seeing a lot of that taking place. Some reporting I've read says that this is the most mid-decade redistricting that the U.S. has seen since the 80s. And it's ahead of midterm elections, right? States are constitutionally mandated to redraw these lines in response to census data, but doing it in the middle, in between censuses is unusual, right?
It's extremely unusual. And really what triggered all of this was President Trump pressuring Texas to do it last summer. And that kind of set off this crazy gerrymandering arms race. And we never had a president of the United States basically telling states, you need to redistrict so that your party, my party, doesn't lose the House so that I'm not held accountable. We never had a president in, I think, the history of America who had done that. And so that set off this crazy spree of gerrymandering. And then the Supreme Court made it a whole lot worse by effectively destroying the Voting Rights Act and then allowing all of these southern states to redistrict basically as the midterms were much closer. And so I think those two things, President Trump pressuring states to gerrymander, and then the Supreme Court giving southern states a green light to gerrymander, specifically to eliminate majority black districts, that makes this really unprecedented in terms of the amount of gerrymandering we're seeing before the midterm elections. In an off-year election, when there's not really supposed to be any kind of gerrymandering, these maps are already supposed to be set in place and should not have been redrawn until after the 2030 census.
It seems like Trump sort of says the quiet part out loud. That's always part of his thing, right? Where it seems like the Republicans were always leaning in this direction. Am I correct in saying that? But it expedited sort of by him just saying those things that they say in private out loud.
Absolutely. I mean, he just flat out said we're entitled to 5 seats in Texas. I mean, you never had a president talk that way before. Redistricting was supposed to be something that the states did, right? And the states determined their own maps. And even, you may remember, Texas did its own mid-decade redistricting in 2003 that then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay oversaw. And that was unprecedented at the time because you had a leader of Congress basically pressuring his state to redistrict. Now, I would argue that was different. It was bad, but it was different because A, Tom DeLay was from Texas, and B, Texas had shifted. It did have a map that was more friendly to Democrats than you could argue the state as a whole had become. The state had become more Republican. And so DeLay argued, okay, Republicans are entitled to more seats, therefore we have to do this mid-decade redistricting. Again, I think it was norm-shattering and wrong, but it was somewhat defensible in a political context. Texas had just drawn its maps. I mean, it literally drew maps that were friendly to the Republican Party in 2021. And then you have Trump, without really any political shifts, just saying, we need to do this because I'm entitled to more seats. And he, in fact, was strong-arming. If you had taken a poll of Texas Republicans, they did not want to do this. But basically, the fact that the president of the United States pressured states to do it and then just openly said, we are doing this so that I can have more seats, so that we don't lose the House. Yeah, that had never happened before.
Well, he also pressured lawmakers in Indiana. He wanted Indiana to redraw its own maps to create additional Republican seats, and Republicans in that state weren't so excited about it. Trump started endorsing their opponents in the primaries and rallying up people against, rhinos, Republicans in name only. They're redistricting in a way that's an act of partisan gerrymandering, benefits their party, but why would a politician not want to do that?
Well, there were different reasons why they didn't want to do it in Indiana.
Okay.
I think that they kind of prided themselves on being slightly different kind of Republicans. This is the state that Mike Pence is from, for example. So they might not be as crazy about Trump as, I mean, he tried to kill his vice president. So I think they might be a little less pro-Trump than maybe some other red states. And I think there was they're feeling that, listen, they already had a 7-2 advantage in the state's congressional delegation. That's already a pretty big Republican advantage. What's the point in doing it? Now, obviously, there was a lot of political backlash to that. Most of the senators that voted against it were ousted in primaries. That has obviously put a lot of additional pressure on other Republican states to do this kind of thing. You just saw, for example, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision destroying the Voting Rights Act, the South Carolina Senate voted not to redistrict, and Trump was very angry about that, and then pressured the governor to call a special session to force him to redistrict, even though the governor said he wasn't going to do it. And so basically, I mean, I think that in the wake of Indiana, the White House is even more out to blood than they were before in terms of trying to maximally pressure states to do it. And obviously, they feel like the courts are going to let them get away with anything at this point.
You know, what's kind of interesting is you mentioned Indiana being not, perhaps not exactly as pro-Trump as Texas, which I believe is they're going to be naming a highway after Trump while he's still in office in that state.
A man who famously drives.
It's kind of like this is kind of like the white collar version of January 6th in some way, right? Like it's in the sense that it is an attack on democracy, but they're trying to do it through legislative. I'm fascinated by the fact that Trump is out so aggressively pressuring them, and I feel like, am I wrong in thinking that this is something that will really kind of imbue Trump with a level of authoritarian power in some of these states? I mean, if he's out there actually calling the shots on how people should vote and things like that, I feel like it specifically empowers his brand of Trumpism and perhaps for years to come in those states.
Yeah, well, it really just incentivizes the worst kind of partisanship and the most blatant race to the bottom in terms of shattering any kind of democratic norm. It's basically another version of rigging an election because you're predetermining election outcomes ahead of time. So you don't have to overturn the election. I mean, you don't have to do January 6th if you can basically surgically limit representation for your political opponents. Now, we'll see whether they're able to do that effectively everywhere. There are some questions about in Texas and Florida, did they draw these maps quite so foolproof, or will there be some kind of backlash against it? This has been quite unpopular in a lot of places where voters have not been able to weigh in on it. But certainly, I mean, Trump is going to try to do this everywhere. And I think it is very blatantly authoritarian in the sense that Trump is right now basically his lowest approval rating ever. There would have been no question whatsoever that he would have lost the House if not for the fact of this gerrymandering and favorable decisions by the Supreme Court and the Virginia Supreme Court to basically side with Republicans to the point where they're now up 10 House seats, not because they did anything popular. They're in fact quite unpopular, but simply because they control the drawing of the lines. And I think that a lot of what authoritarian is about is holding power despite the fact that you're unpopular and manipulating the political system so you stay in power despite your unpopularity so that there's no way for the public to be able to demonstrate their opposition to the party in power. And gerrymandering takes away a lot of the public's ability to hold the party in power accountable in a lot of these places. And so, I mean, there are districts that would have been competitive that otherwise now won't be competitive, and there will be representatives that have been around a long time who will no longer be there, who are probably popular in their district. I mean, if you took a poll of the constituents in some of these districts that they're eliminating, and you said, do you want your longtime member of Congress to be eliminated and replaced by someone just because President Trump wants more power? I think they would be very opposed to that. So I do think it's pretty frightening in terms of the long-term ramifications of American politics, not to mention that the only solution that Democrats seem to have in response to this is we're just going to do our own gerrymandering. And so basically it just becomes kind of a race to the bottom of every state just gerrymanders maximally, no matter where you live.
Well, you mentioned it earlier. We've alluded to it a few times. The Supreme Court essentially demolishing what remained of the Voting Rights Act. For people that aren't familiar with that piece of legislation, can you explain what that is first and what the Supreme Court decision was that ripped out what remained of its guts?
Yeah, so what the Voting Rights Act did in 1965 was it really ended the Jim Crow system of the disenfranchisement of Black voters in the segregated South by getting rid of those literacy tests and poll taxes and all-white primaries and all the things that had been done to disenfranchise Black voters for so many years in the Jim Crow South. And it led to a huge registration of Black voters. And then it was ultimately expanded to protect voters of color across the country and led to a huge shift in office holding, where you had the first Black and Hispanic and Asian American lawmakers, and of course, eventually led to the first Black president and many other things in America. And what this decision did, which came on the heels of a number of other decisions weakening the Voting Rights Act, was basically said that districts that were drawn that would allow communities of color to elect their preferred candidates, those are no longer constitutional, essentially, is what it said. And so if you had a majority Black district in the South, this case specifically revolved around Louisiana. Louisiana drew a second majority Black district under a court order that found that the map that basically diluted Black votes was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court basically said it was unconstitutional to draw a second majority Black district, and that there had to be a much higher bar. I would argue it's now basically an impossible bar to be able to protect these districts. And what it means functionally is that all across the South now, Republicans are eliminating majority Black districts. In most cases, these are majority Black districts that were drawn in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and they represented the first time that Black people were elected in the South since Reconstruction. So there basically was a situation during Reconstruction after the Civil War when Black men got the right to vote and Black people held office all across the South. And then Jim Crow began, and you had violence and fraud, and then ultimately the changing of constitutions throughout the South to implement things like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all-white primaries and property requirements and all those things. And then you had no black office holding in most of these states for nearly 100 years until the Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, I think you can argue quite literally that this decision is sending us back to what happened in the Jim Crow era, where there were huge black populations, but there were no black members of Congress because there was no functional way for anyone to vote for them or for them to be elected.
So you wrote a piece recently at Mother Jones, I'll link to it in the description, that I found pretty compelling. It's called "Republicans Don't Need to Win Elections Anymore. They Just Need Their Judges." And you wrote this right after a judge in Virginia blocked the state's redistricting effort, which was supported by 3 million voters, right? Like, a lot of this redistricting stuff, it's happening with state elected officials that kind of decide on their own terms they want to do this. But in Virginia's case, the laws are a little different. They had a ballot referendum, I believe, right? People voted in support of it. They went ahead redistrict in a way that benefited Democrats. And when it got challenged in court, the court struck it down and said, you can't do that. But these judges, whether it's the Supreme Court or in Republican majority states or Republican appointed judges, don't seem to be holding these GOP-led efforts to this same, legal minutia, legal nuance, technicality kind of stuff. Can you explain the role of the judicial system here? Because it sounds like that is what's turning the key, that is opening the gates here to me.
I think that's basically right. I mean, if you look at the situation before the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and the Virginia Supreme Court weighed in, the parties were basically equal in terms of redistricting, even with Texas and all of these other Republican states drawing new maps. The fact that California found a way to draw new maps, and then there were some other smaller victories in states like Utah, for example, the parties were roughly even. So this was going to be basically a wash. And then the two courts stepping in changed all of that. The U.S. Supreme Court effectively destroying the Voting Rights Act and leaving southern states time to redistrict for 2026. Really, they put their thumb on the scale of the midterms. I think a lot of people thought they're going to at least wait till June to make it functionally impossible for these states to do it because they don't want to be seen as interfering in the midterms. Well, far from not wanting to be seen as interfering in the midterms, they were more than happy to interfere in the midterms. And I think basically it just boils down to the fact that they saw that Republicans were going to lose the House. And they saw that Trump was going to be held accountable. And they basically decided that they were going to issue their decision in a way that was maximally beneficial to the Republican Party. And I think that is really a whole new low for the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, I think it's a version of the immunity case, but for the Republican Party in the House, basically saying, you can't be held accountable anymore. They told Trump he was not going to be held accountable for the January 6th insurrection. I believe that had such a big impact on deciding the 2024 election, and obviously just set such a chilling precedent. And I believe that this case in the Voting Rights Act was their version of that for this election, which is we are going to put our thumb on the scale to help the Republican Party in this election. And then the Virginia Supreme Court, just afterwards, the fact that they retroactively overturned an election when 3 million people voted was really, really shocking because you thought, okay, the election's been decided. They're going to defer to the will of the Virginia voters. Virginia was only the second state after California where anyone voted on redistricting. So in all of these red states that have redistricted, the public hasn't had the ability to weigh in anywhere. Virginia had a much higher bar to clear. The voters weighed in on it, and basically they overturned it on what is a fairly minor technicality. They said that the constitutional amendment essentially authorizing the vote in Virginia had to occur before and after the election. And the fact that it occurred during early voting meant that the election had already began. Now, the judges argued about this. The dissenting judges said, actually, the election isn't until election day. You've redefined what election day actually means. But regardless, to overturn an election on what is a fairly minor technicality, to me is really chilling in the national context of redistricting, but also just chilling in terms of this is exactly what Trump tried to do in 2020. He tried to overturn the election based on what he argued were irregularities. And that's what they want to do in the future. They want to try to find whatever they think are minor like irregularities. A lot, obviously, there was no actual fraud they found, but nonetheless, even if they could point to some small thing, the idea that you would then void an election based on that small technicality, I think, has chilling ramifications beyond Virginia, and makes me very nervous about what might happen in November, quite honestly.
When you say you're nervous, what exactly would come of this? In a practical sense, like what? How does it actually shape the results?
Well, I think in this case, they voided an entire election. So, I mean, that would make me nervous that there would be challenges to an election after the fact, and the courts would now feel that they have a precedent to void the election. Also, other things happened. For example, the Louisiana governor just suspended his state's U.S. House primary and issued an emergency declaration suspending that election to give the legislature more time to redraw maps. I mean, that is worrisome in terms of that we've now normalized retroactively overturning elections. We've now normalized suspending elections. I mean, these are things that Trump might want to do in the future. And people are already worried, for example, what if Trump tries to halt ballot counting in states that are counting mail ballots in a way that are favorable to Democrats? What if Trump seizes voting machines? What if the Department of Justice files litigation challenging the results of elections where Democrats win? These are all things that we're concerned about happening in November. And I think the redistricting cases, it might have no impact on this, but I think we've seen democracy be narrowed and, I would argue, shattered in ways that we didn't expect from courts and from politicians in the last few weeks, in ways that makes me less certain that votes will be protected in November.
Even if these specific cases don't end up being a deciding factor, the capital S, capital P serious pundits, right? That will go on TV and try to downplay some of these threats to democracy, or that might even be too harsh of terms, but we'll try to rationalize it, be like, well, the courts will hold. We have 3 branches of government, checks and balances, whatever. I think some of these decisions show that those courts might not be as reliable in protecting democracy as people might want to hope, and that's kind of a heavy thing for me to sit with.
Well, I think the courts, state courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court has made it very clear they want Republicans to win the midterms. I mean, I think there was absolutely no doubt about this. And this happened in Virginia. There was a similar situation where the Missouri Supreme Court greenlit a gerrymander there hours after oral arguments had ended, even though Missouri has prohibitions on gerrymandering, even though 300,000 signatures had been submitted to block that referendum. They allowed it to go into effect. So that's another state court. I'm fully expecting the Florida Supreme Court is going to push aside another constitutional amendment that voters approved to allow that gerrymander to go into effect because Ron DeSantis appointed a majority of the judges on the Florida Supreme Court. So I think state Supreme Courts that have Republican majorities have made it clear that they want these maps to go into effect. And the U.S. Supreme Court has made it very, very clear they want to make it as easy as possible for Republicans to pick up as many seats as possible. And that was clear not just from the decision on the Voting Rights Act, but the aftermath of the decision on the Voting Rights Act. They allowed Louisiana's map to go into effect immediately without giving opponents an opportunity to challenge it in the lower courts for rehearing so that the Louisiana governor would be able to suspend the election. They, in the case of Alabama, basically there was an appeal. Alabama was blocked from redistricting through 2030 because of a federal court decision that found that the state had intentionally discriminated against Black voters. It was a very thorough finding by a federal court that had 2 Trump appointees on the panel that found this. And the Supreme Court briefs, this is a little tactical, briefs were due by Monday at 5. Alabama had requested a hearing on whether it could redistrict, a ruling on whether it could redistrict by Thursday, okay? Usually the Supreme Court waits until the state says, this is the deadline that we need. They ruled an hour after receiving briefs. There's no way they could have even read the briefing in the case in that period of time. And they allowed Alabama to gerrymander, despite the fact that a federal court had found Alabama guilty of intentional discrimination, with the primary 1 week away after they had said in the case of Texas that a lower court decision 15 weeks before the primary blocking that state's map was too close to the election to implement. So, I mean, they have just basically disregarded every single norm they have to help the Republican Party. So, I mean, listen, if there's like some crazy lawsuit like in 2020 where it's so absolutely clear it's completely meritless to try to overturn the election, like I don't think they're going to go for that again. But if they feel like there's some kind of legitimate dispute, a Bush v. Gore situation, for example, where they can rule for the Republican Party in a way that could decide elections, I absolutely think the Supreme Court is willing to do that.
Well, they already did that there.
Yeah, I mean, they already did it in 2000.
It was a much fairer Supreme Court, like in theory.
It was a much fairer Supreme Court, and it was a much more legitimate dispute about the counting of ballots, and it was 537 votes. I mean, I still think Bush v. Gore was the wrong decision. But I think that what they could do now is significantly worse. And so I think if there are challenges to the 2026 election, the Supreme Court has to adjudicate them. I'm very nervous about what they're going to do based on how they've put their thumb on the scale of the election already.
One thing this makes me think of is just from Bush v. Gore, it does feel like the writing was on the wall that the Republicans, as they were going, needed to make adjustments in the way they approached the electorate. You know, and they were starting to do that. They were trying to reach out to Hispanic voters. They were trying to do different things in the early parts of this century. And after Trump won, he kind of took the Peter Brimlow strategy of like doubling down on the white population.
Yeah.
And it was from Ann Coulter's book, Adios America. And I think the reason why the Republican Party never did that, at least the bigwigs of the Republican Party didn't like that idea, even if they made all kinds of racist appeals, is because it was an electoral dead end with changing demographics and stuff like that. And it feels like there's this confluence of their path to election and future, like thinning out as it is right there, and these maneuvers that are becoming increasingly authoritarian to try to maintain dominance in elections. And it's almost like watching like a slow motion car crash to me, right? Because we've had these things and everybody's pointing to January 6th and be like, hey, this is really scary. This is completely against the norms of this country. And, most of the population is checked out. And I guess to put a question on it, it feels like, as Jared said, this is like a really unpopular thing to do. It's not something people would like. And yet it's happening. Do you feel that people are aware of the threat of this, or people are aware at that level? I feel like the American public is just completely checked out from these type of details. They just glaze over when you start talking about court cases.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they're aware of the larger strategy at play that you just elucidated. The fact that the country is becoming more diverse, that it's heading towards a majority-minority country, and that a lot of what is being done to subvert democracy is being done to protect a white majority before it becomes a white minority. I mean, I think that is a larger organizing principle of why the Republican Party is doing this. The irony, of course, is that Trump actually did a lot better in 2024 with some of these demographic groups, but he slipped very quickly with a lot of this new support. He has lost huge ground among young voters, Black voters, Latino voters. And when I think that became clear to them, instead of trying to reach out to those voters, the idea was, well, let's go back to the playbook of trying to suppress them. And both the gerrymandering and then, of course, Trump's real kind of all-out push for the SAVE Act and basically saying, if we don't pass this, we're going to lose the midterms. That also was unprecedented, basically saying we have to change voting laws or we're going to lose. Usually these voting laws were supposed to be couched in rhetoric of election integrity and protecting the vote. And Trump basically said, we just need them to help the Republican Party, which again, saying the quiet part out loud. But I think that their whole strategy is basically trying to manipulate the electorate right now to be able to hold power, because they're not doing anything to try to become more popular. In fact, he keeps becoming more unpopular in terms of how things are going with the economy and the war and all of these other issues. So I mean, it is really staggering that there's even a question about whether Democrats are going to win in 2026, given how things are going. Like I said, if it hadn't been for the U.S. Supreme Court and the Virginia Supreme Court, there would have been basically no doubt that Republicans were going to lose the House. Now it's basically Republicans are starting on the 40-yard line in the football game, before there's ever been a snap. And I will say, though, that the thing that I worry about in terms of, I do think that the Supreme Court's decision has gotten a lot of attention, and I think it has outraged people more than court cases normally do. I would maybe liken it to the Dobbs decision, for example, and something that has seemed to broken through and angered people. But I think the fear to me is that it's described only in partisan terms. And I think it's much bigger than that, because I think the Voting Rights Act at the end of the day was not a partisan piece of legislation. It really was a piece of legislation that had strong bipartisan support to make America a multiracial democracy. And if you look at the states and the districts that are being eliminated, these are districts that elected the first Black members of Congress since Reconstruction. And so you're not just like ousting a random Democrat in Kansas or Nebraska. I mean, you literally are wiping back civil rights 150 years by eliminating these districts. And to me, that has very broad ramifications on whether America will remain a multiracial democracy. And I think you could argue that if these southern states get their way outside of Georgia and North Carolina, the South will not be a multiracial democracy anymore. The South will be an all-white democracy, just like it was, which is not a democracy, just like it was under Jim Crow, where at every single level, there will be all-white politicians, or there'll be a few politicians of color who are Republicans, but don't actually represent their constituents. And so I think that is much more alarming than whether one party is up or down in a redistricting fight.
Yeah, and it's also the kind of thing that would sustain after Trump, right? A lot of liberals or even some Democratic politicians talk about Trump as if he is like, if he's the problem. But the issues at play here are so much larger, right? And redrawing these maps could have ripple effects for years and years and years, not just in midterms, but in elections to come. You mentioned that Trump is, kind of dropping this veil of the justifications typically offered for these kind of things: election integrity, security, and just saying, we got to do this or we're going to get our asses kicked, for lack of a better word. And I just wrote a piece for my day job at Open Measures. If it's out by the time this episode comes out, we'll put a link in the description to that. But what's been interesting to me is watching how the MAGA movement, which, notoriously in 2020 and ever since, has been drilling into this election integrity line that voting in this country is irredeemably corrupt and the whole system is stacked against Republicans and whatnot, has now seemed to just 180 pivot and be like, well, we have to stack the deck. We have to do this. And it's hypocritical. Maybe that doesn't matter anymore. But what have you been seeing in terms of like how Republicans are justifying this to their base? Because partisan gerrymandering or gerrymandering at all is totally unpopular. That YouGov survey I mentioned earlier found that more than 3/4 of the country thinks it should be illegal, right?
Yeah.
And other countries don't do this. They have independent, bureaucrats draw the lines based on data. But this is hugely unpopular. People hate this in principle. But those numbers are also shifting where Republicans are starting to pull higher and being more open to this idea and being more supportive of it. I'm curious, like, what kind of messaging you've seen them put out in terms of justifying this.
Well, I think this has just become another litmus test for being MAGA, whether you're willing to draw lines that are just designed for maximum party advantage. And I mean, even in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision, they're like, for example, Alabama and Louisiana, for reasons of political expediency or time or whatever, passed maps that preserved one of their majority Black districts. So they eliminated one. These states had two. They eliminated one. But they kept one, and that could sort of let them argue that it's not Jim Crow or whatever because we still have black representatives. The MAGA base is furious about this. They want all Republican maps everywhere. Basically, their argument is if Trump won the state, Republicans are entitled to all of the seats. Now, that's not
how that works.
That's not how it works. That's not how it works. And the thing is so crazy is, like, I live in New York. There are Republican areas of New York. I believe that those areas are entitled to representation based on what the voters in those districts believe. So we're basically headed towards an electoral college for U.S. House, where basically if you're a blue state, all of your reps are Democratic. And if you're a red state, it's winner take all, essentially, is what's happening. Everyone's going to be Republican. And that's not how it's worked historically. But that's how things are heading to the extent that you can manipulate a map in that kind of way. And so I find that very disturbing because basically, even if voters dislike it, all the incentives in the MAGA base are, if we don't do this, we're going to get primaried. Trump's going to come after us. We're going to lose our jobs. And it's yet another way in which the MAGA-verse, the Republican primary trap, infects the entire Republican Party. And so I think the only way to get out of it is if those politicians who can be held accountable, for example, those who run statewide where you can't gerrymander, they are held accountable for this. So like senators who support this, governors who support this, Republicans who support this, who might find themselves in districts that are still remotely competitive. I mean, if you look at the results in special elections where Democrats have overperformed by 10 or 15 points in these special elections, if that happens in November, a lot of Republicans who believe they're safe will not be safe, including some of those in newly gerrymandered seats. And so there has to be some kind of political backlash because until we have a different kind of Congress, and I would argue until we have a different kind of Supreme Court, there's no national reform that can happen. So the only thing you can either do is on the state level, you can try to counteract this in the states that are doing it, or you can have other states fight back, which is what we're heading towards in 2027, 2028, which is just every blue state fights back against every red state. That's what we're heading to. Or you can try to hold some of the people who did this unpopular thing accountable. Now, I think most Americans are far more concerned about gas prices and the cost of living, but maybe you can say to them, hey, guess what? The same people that are fucking you over at the gas pump and ruining your daily lives are also trying to rig the election so you can't vote them out of power. I wouldn't say that would be the first line I would use to try to reach these voters, but maybe it's like the fourth or fifth thing you can remind them of, like another reason to be pissed off. And so I think that's the only way out of it, because I don't see like changing, appealing to the Supreme Court or having this Congress do anything to rectify this.
In your mind, Ari, where does this sit in sort of MAGA's broader efforts to tinker with the ballot box? We mentioned the SAVE Act, which would mandate showing ID to vote, specifically real ID, like just a very restrictive kind of thing. I had to get a real ID at the DMV this week. It was a huge pain in the ass. Trump's talked about wanting to ban mail-in voting. Federal agencies are demanding voter rolls. There was that raid in Fulton County. Where does this redistricting thing, like, how do you understand the redistricting push in the bigger picture of everything that's going around voting ahead of midterms?
I think it's a central part of their strategy to try to interfere in the midterms. I think it was their most important strategy because, again, I feel like they think they could just predetermine outcomes in all of these states. And if they predetermine enough outcomes, maybe they don't have to do the other more potentially extreme things. But I think those things are coming too. I mean, it's very clear the SAVE Act's not passing. So that's going to then lead Trump to go in more extreme directions. I believe that he's going to issue an emergency executive order claiming some kind of emergency powers based on, lies about foreign interference in the 2020 election that he clearly has Tulsi Gabbard and other people working on to basically say, we need to do things like get rid of mail ballots. We need to decertify voting machines, things like that. I believe that would be unconstitutional. Again, I don't know whether this U.S. Supreme Court would say that's unconstitutional, but I think it's very clearly unconstitutional according to the language of the Constitution. And I believe that they are getting ready to do more things like what they did in Fulton County. This hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but they're now broadening their investigation into the 2020 election into Wisconsin. They just showed up at the home of the election director in Milwaukee. So there's clearly a lot going on behind the scenes to reinvestigate 2020, which I believe is aimed at taking more extreme measures in 2026. And so I think we should be, Trump again this week didn't rule out sending federal agents to the polls, but I'm less concerned about people at the polls and more concerned about what they do with the actual process of voting. Like, do they try to stop ballot counting? Do they try to seize voting machines? Do they try to do things like that? How do they contest the outcome of elections if they're close? So all of those things are still to come. And I think that as soon as the gerrymandering wars wind down, which will happen relatively soon because states are just going to actually physically run out of time to draw new maps, that the kind of next phase of the election subversion effort, which is instead of tinkering with district lines, tinkering with the mechanics of how people vote and how elections are counted and how elections are run, I think that part of it's going to kick more into overdrive.
Do you think what messaging would you apply if you were, let's say, the opposition party to the Republicans? Let's say you were the Democrats. Like, what should they be saying here? We're obviously not their keeper and have no relationship with the Democratic Party at all, but that is the opposition party to an increasingly authoritarian GOP. Like, what do they need to be telling the public? Because they're not always good at messaging.
I think we're in, Orbán Hungary territory here. I think
Orbán literally.
I think we veered much more closer to that in the last few weeks with these court decisions. And so I basically think it's the same kind of thing. You need massive, overwhelming turnout to overcome a rigged system. And you have to have lots of people at every level making sure that the elections aren't stolen. In Hungary, they had 50,000 election monitors on the ground to make sure that Orbán's party didn't steal the election. That's an extraordinary number of people in a small country like Hungary. And so I believe that Democrats have to expand the map as much as possible. I think they have to run people in as many places as possible to put Republicans on the defensive. If certain seats are off the table, new seats have to be put on the table. I believe this is the kind of political environment in which you could do that. I don't think we know what is a safe seat right now based on how special elections have gone and how angry people are right now. I believe the backlash to the court's decisions have motivated Democrats a lot more than they've motivated Republicans. And there are a fair number of Republicans that are not going to vote this cycle because Trump's not on the ballot. They're mad about the Iran war. They're mad about the cost of gas. They may still support Trump like nominally, but they're not going to go out and vote in a local off-year election. Democrats are going to vote in those elections. So I think it's really just about, first off, just making the map larger. And then I believe protecting the election is going to require a massive mobilization of civil society, in which Orbán's Hungary is one model, in which the protests in Minneapolis are one model, where people have to be watching. And if the administration sends people to the polls, if the administration does do things like seize voting machines or try to stop ballots, going through the courts can't be the only options. I have lost faith in the courts in the last few weeks. I think that courts might act in ways that are contrary to Trump if he tries to subvert democracy altogether, but I don't have faith.
Not when it really matters.
I don't have certainty that will happen. So I think there has to be a lot of public pressure on here. And basically, what I took away from the way the Supreme Court's acting is they're daring somebody to stop them. And they don't believe that Democrats have the balls to do anything about what their actions are. And so I believe that if Democrats took a more confrontational approach towards the Supreme Court, it could both build public support for reforming the court, but it could also maybe convince the court to back down a little bit. You have the famous FDR example where FDR didn't succeed in packing the court, but he did succeed in getting the court to stop striking down his New Deal legislation. And so I believe we are heading into an era where we have to take the court on more in a more aggressive and more head-on way, and really describe how these people are not just conservative, because people understand they're conservative, but they're partisan. They're partisan Republicans, and I don't believe that the average American wants the Supreme Court to act in an outright partisan way. I think they believe the judiciary should sort of call it as they see it, and they understand that sometimes they do things that might be unpopular, but just the idea that the Supreme Court would put its thumb on the scale of a increasingly unpopular president, I think just strikes most Americans as the wrong way for the Supreme Court to be acting.
Well, Ari, thanks for joining us today to break all of that down. Maybe not a feel-good episode, but certainly super important for people to have on their radars and just fully understand the gravity of what's going on. We like to say that Posting Through It is a music podcast, and we're known to get a little political sometimes. So I want to know, when you're filing in your drafts of stories or, looking through court decisions and stuff, what kind of tunes are you bumping, Ari?
Man, I have to say, this was kind of a Rage Against the Machine last few weeks.
Yeah.
For me, where
Do you have a favorite album?
I was just kind of in like a Bulls on Parade mood in response to some of these court decisions. I at times I was trying to.
I just want to say that's my youngest son's walk-up music in Little League.
Nice, yeah, great song. But I was trying to kind of like lower the temperature. But at those moments where, soft jazz wasn't working for me, sometimes I just had to put on some really loud, angry music and just kind of rage a little bit. So I did have an experience where I was in the car and I put on Rage Against the Machine and I played it very loudly, and it did make me feel better for about 2 minutes.
There's two wolves inside. Ari Berman, Bulls on Parade, and a compilation of greatest hits from Duke Ellington.
There we go. Exactly.
All right. Thanks so much, Ari.
Music. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you guys.